It is the middle of the night, somewhere behind the lines, and a telegraph operator is hunched over his key, trying to send an urgent message to headquarters. He taps out the signal. Nothing. He tries again. Still nothing. The line that should carry his words crackling across 100 miles of wire is dead, completely silent. He doesn't know it yet, but miles away, out in the darkness, a column of horsemen has already done its work. They rode in fast, cut the wire, burned the poles, and vanished back into the night before anyone could stop them. In a matter of minutes, they have severed the nervous system of an entire army. That silent telegraph key is the sound of a Civil War general's worst nightmare beginning. Because here is something that surprises almost everyone who studies this war. The thing that commanders feared most was not the massive enemy army marching toward them across an open field. They could see that army. They could count it, locate it, plan for it. What truly terrified them was a few hundred horsemen they could not see at all. Fast-moving raiders who appeared out of nowhere, struck at the things an army cannot live without, and disappeared before a response could even be organized. A full enemy army was a problem you could solve. A cavalry raid was a problem you couldn't even find. And by the time you understood what it had done, it was already too late. This is the story of why the most dangerous force on a Civil War battlefield often wasn't the one you were facing. It was the one slipping around behind you. Picture that same general the next morning, standing over his map. In one sense, he is in control. He knows roughly where the main enemy army is. He has his scouts' reports, his own observations, the accumulated intelligence of weeks of campaigning. The big, visible threat in front of him is accounted for. That part of the map makes sense. But now look behind his own lines, and that's where the map turns to fog. His telegraph is down, so he can't get fresh reports from his supply bases. He doesn't know if the railroad that feeds his army is intact or torn up. He doesn't know if the depot holding his ammunition is safe or in flames. He doesn't know whether the bridge his wagons need to cross tomorrow is still standing. Somewhere in his rear, horsemen are loose, and he has no idea where they are, how many they are, or what they've already destroyed. This is the peculiar horror of the cavalry raid. It doesn't attack the part of the war the general is watching. It attacks the part he has his back to. The enemy in front is a known quantity. The raiders behind are pure uncertainty. And uncertainty, for a man responsible for tens of thousands of lives, is its own kind of terror. A general can fight an army he can see. What paralyzes him is not knowing whether the ground he's standing on is about to collapse beneath him. And to understand why a handful of raiders could create that much fear, you first have to understand just how fragile a Civil War army really was. From a distance, a Civil War army looked like an unstoppable mass, thousands upon thousands of men with rifles and cannon. But that image is deceiving. An army of that size was, in truth, an enormously delicate machine, and it depended on a long, vulnerable chain of support just to stay alive. Start with the railroads. This was the first great war of the railroad age, and the trains were the lifeblood of both sides. They carried food, ammunition, weapons, reinforcements, and the wounded. An army operating deep in enemy territory might be fed almost entirely by a single rail line stretching back hundreds of miles to its base. Cut that line, and the trains stop, and the food stops with them. But the railroad only reached so far. From the railhead, everything had to be loaded onto wagons and hauled the rest of the way to the troops. So an army also depended on huge, slow-moving wagon trains, and on the thousands of horses and mules that pulled them. Those animals had to be fed too, which meant forage, which meant yet another constant demand flowing through the supply chain. Then there was communication. The telegraph let commanders coordinate movements across vast distances, sending orders and receiving reports in something close to real time. It tied the whole war machine together. Now stack it all up. Food, ammunition, forage, wagons, horses, railroads, telegraph wires. Every one of these was essential, and every one of them ran through the army's rear, the very area a raid was designed to strike. An army was only as strong as the thin lines of supply and communication feeding it, and cavalry was the perfect weapon for cutting exactly those lines. When most people picture cavalry, they imagine a thunderous saber charge crashing into enemy lines. That happened, but it was rarely the most important thing horsemen did. The real job of cavalry was something far more vital. and far more dangerous to the enemy. First, they were the eyes of the army. Mounted scouts ranged out ahead and to the sides, finding the enemy, counting his strength, watching his movements, and reporting back. A general's picture of the battlefield was built almost entirely on what his cavalry could see for him. Second, they were a screen. Just as their own scouts gathered information, cavalry also blinded the enemy's scouts, placing a moving wall of horsemen between the armies so the other side couldn't see what was happening behind it. Good cavalry could hide an entire army's movements. Third, they were the pursuers. When an enemy broke and ran, it was the cavalry that chased him down, turning a retreat into a rout. And fourth, the role at the heart of this story, they were the raiders. Fast, mobile, and able to cover ground no infantry could match, cavalry could sweep deep behind enemy lines and destroy the things that kept an army alive. The railroads, the bridges, the depots, the telegraph, the supply wagons. That combination made cavalry unique. They were both the eyes of the army and the knife in its hand. They could tell a general everything he needed to know, and they could reach out and cut the throat of the enemy's entire campaign without ever fighting his main force. It was that last ability, the raid, that turned a few hundred horsemen into a weapon that could spread panic across an entire region. Here is the secret to the cavalry raid's power. Its real damage was often not physical at all. It was psychological. A raid created fear far out of proportion to its actual size. Imagine you're a Union officer guarding a stretch of territory, and word arrives that enemy horsemen have just burned a supply depot 40 miles away. How many were there? You don't know. Where are they headed now? You don't know. Is this a small raiding party or the leading edge of a full-scale invasion? You have no way to tell. So the rumors take over. A few hundred raiders become, in the panicked retelling, thousands. One burning depot becomes the sign of a massive army on the move. Frightened civilians flee, militias are called out, and commanders all across the region start pulling troops in different directions to chase a threat they can't even measure. A single fast-moving column could throw an entire theater of the war into chaos, simply because no one knew what it would do next. And the physical damage, when it came, struck at the most sensitive points imaginable. One torn-up railroad could delay an entire campaign by days or weeks because the trains carrying everything an army needed suddenly had nowhere to run. One burned bridge could force thousands of men to halt and wait. One destroyed depot could wipe out supplies it had taken months to gather. So the raid hit twice. First, it destroyed something real and irreplaceable. Then it spread a wave of confusion and fear that did even more damage than the flames. A handful of riders could make a general feel as though the ground behind him was crawling with enemies. And in this war, certain men became absolute masters of that terrifying art. The great cavalry raiders of the Civil War became legends in their own time, feared by their enemies and celebrated by their own side. Both the North and the South produced commanders who turned mounted raiding into something close to an art form. For the Confederacy, the most famous was Jeb Stuart, the flamboyant, plumed-hat cavalier who served as the eyes of Robert E. Lee's army. Early in the war, Stuart pulled off one of the most audacious feats imaginable. He rode his cavalry in a complete circle entirely around the Union Army, gathering intelligence and humiliating his enemy in the process. His scouting was so good that Lee came to depend on him utterly to know where the enemy was. Out in the Western Theater, the Confederacy had an even more feared figure, Nathan Bedford Forrest. He had no formal military training at all, yet he became perhaps the most naturally gifted cavalry commander of the entire war. His philosophy was brutally simple: move fast, hit hard, and arrive first with overwhelming force. He tore Union supply lines to shreds again and again. He was also a deeply controversial and dark figure, tied to atrocity during the war and to a notorious organization after it. But as a pure raider, his enemies considered him the most dangerous man on horseback in America. There was John Hunt Morgan, whose riders swept north on a spectacular raid that carried them deeper into Union territory than almost any other Confederate force, throwing entire northern states into panic. And there was Joseph Wheeler, who relentlessly harassed Union armies in the West and lived to become, remarkably, a United States general decades later. But the North produced master raiders of its own. Benjamin Grierson, a former music teacher who reportedly disliked horses, led one of the most brilliant raids of the war, riding hundreds of miles straight through the heart of Confederate Mississippi, wrecking railroads and drawing the enemy's attention away at a crucial moment. Philip Sheridan became the aggressive, hard-driving commander who would eventually hunt down and kill Stuart himself, then lay waste to an entire valley. And James Wilson led what became the largest cavalry force of the war, a mounted sledgehammer that smashed through the South in the final months, destroying the Confederacy's remaining war industry. Each of these men proved the same point in his own way. A relatively small force of horsemen, well led, could change the course of a campaign. And the flip side proved it just as powerfully. Because cavalry were the eyes of the army, losing them at the wrong moment could be catastrophic. In the war's most famous example, Stuart took his horsemen off on a long, glory-seeking ride at the very moment Lee needed them most, marching his infantry blindly into enemy territory. Without his cavalry's eyes, Lee stumbled into the enemy almost by accident and was forced into a massive battle on ground he had not chosen, a battle that became one of the great turning points of the war. The absence of the raiders proved nearly as decisive as their presence. That is how central these horsemen had become to the entire machinery of command. Now we arrive at the real reason generals feared these raiders, a cruel dilemma that cavalry raids forced upon every commander. An army has only so many men, and a general wants to do one thing above all: concentrate his force, gather his strength into a powerful fist, and use it to win the decisive battle. Every soldier he pulls away to guard something is a soldier missing from that fist. But cavalry raids made concentration almost impossible. If raiders were loose in his rear, threatening his railroads and depots, the general had to peel off troops to protect them, guarding bridges, garrisoning supply bases, escorting wagon trains, patrolling miles of vulnerable track. The more he feared the raiders, the more men he had to scatter across the countryside to defend against them. And every man assigned to guard the rear was a man who wasn't available for the battle out front. This was the true genius of the raid. A few thousand horsemen could force the enemy to tie down many times their own number in defensive duty. By simply existing as a threat, a single raider could neutralize far more enemy troops than he could ever defeat in a fight. The most famous example of this dread was the way one of the Union's greatest generals reacted to Forrest. He considered the Confederate raiders such a deadly menace to his supply lines that he declared Forrest had to be hunted down and destroyed no matter the cost, even if it meant sacrificing thousands of men and emptying the treasury to do it. That is not how you talk about an ordinary enemy. That is how you talk about a force that can unravel your entire campaign from behind. The raid put every commander in an impossible position: protect your rear and weaken your army, or concentrate your army and expose your lifelines. There was no good answer, and that was exactly the point. In the early years of the war, the Confederacy held the clear advantage in cavalry. The South had a deep tradition of horsemanship, plenty of skilled riders, and commanders like Stuart and Forrest who ran rings around their opponents. Union cavalry, by comparison, was disorganized and outmatched, and the Confederate raiders seemed to strike at will. But that balance did not last. As the war ground on, the North's enormous advantages in industry, organization, and supply began to transform its cavalry into something the Confederacy could no longer answer. The Union reorganized its horsemen into large, powerful corps under aggressive commanders. It mounted them on a never-ending stream of fresh horses that the South simply could not match. And, crucially, it armed many of them with rapid-firing, repeating carbines, weapons that let a single Union trooper put out several times the firepower of a man with an old single-shot rifle. A dismounted line of Union cavalry with repeaters could now hold ground against far larger forces. With these advantages, Union cavalry stopped being merely a tool for scouting and small raids. It became a strategic weapon of destruction in its own right. Late in the war, Union mounted forces didn't just cut a railroad here or burn a depot there. They systematically dismantled the Confederacy's ability to wage war, stripping and burning entire valleys that fed Southern armies, and tearing through the South's remaining factories, foundries, and rail networks on a massive scale. The raid had grown up. What began as fast, improvised strikes by daring horsemen evolved into deliberate, large-scale campaigns aimed at destroying an enemy's capacity to move, supply, and sustain itself. By the end, Union cavalry was no longer just harassing the Confederacy. It was helping to kill it, and it had the final word in the most literal way possible. For when the Confederate government collapsed and its fleeing president tried to escape into the Deep South, it was Union cavalry that ran him down and captured him, closing the book on the rebellion from the saddle. So we come back to the question we started with. Why did Civil War generals fear cavalry raids more than the full armies marching against them? The answer lies in what a raid actually attacks. A full enemy army threatens the visible parts of war, the men, the guns, the ground. Those are things a general can see, measure, and plan against. He can mass his troops, choose his position, and meet the threat head-on. It is frightening, but it is a known kind of fear. A cavalry raid is different. It attacks the invisible parts of war, the things that don't appear in the line of battle, but without which no army can function. It attacks time by delaying campaigns and forcing armies to wait. It attacks information by cutting the telegraph and blinding the commander. It attacks supply by burning the food and ammunition and tearing up the rails that carry them. And most powerfully of all, it attacks confidence, replacing a general's sense of control with a gnawing uncertainty about what is happening behind his own back. That is the fear behind the fear. A general can stand firm against an army he can see. What he cannot stand is the feeling that the ground beneath him is no longer solid, that at any moment word may arrive that his lifeline has been severed, his plans undone, by an enemy he never even glimpsed. The full army threatened to defeat him in battle. The cavalry raid threatened something worse, to dissolve the very foundation his army stood on, quietly, from the shadows, before a single shot was fired in the fight he was preparing for. And that is why, when a telegraph key fell silent in the night, a commander's blood ran cold, because he knew that somewhere out in the dark, the most dangerous weapon of the war was already riding for home, its work done, and the damage only beginning to reveal itself.